Hello, you're listening to E-Bible Fellowship's new open forum excerpts, and now we present the following excerpt.
Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
You mentioned faint not at tribulations, and then you mentioned the great tribulation. I was just wondering what's the other tribulation called? The lesser tribulation?
Well, the statement in 2 Thessalonians 1, recompense of tribulation. There's also a similar statement in Jeremiah where God speaks of repaying the king of Babylon. And so we have to understand the two judgments, these two tribulations. The first is called Great Tribulation, and we can clearly relate it to the judgment on the church. We have the timeline for 23 full years. And yet God tells us in a number of places, Jeremiah 25, he tells us that he will begin judgment at the city called by his name, and he uses King Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonians to carry out the judgment. And then after telling us that, we find the recompense. If we go to Jeremiah 25, and again, verse 11, this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 70 years was the historical duration for Judah's judgment, their tribulation, but it points to the great tribulation judgment on the church of 23 full years. So we can read that, okay, God's going to use Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, to judge the churches, and even to a degree, the world, comes under his power, Satan's power and authority to a greater degree than ever before. But then notice verse 12, Jeremiah 25:12, and it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith Jehovah, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations, and it will bring upon that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, even all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. So Nebuchadnezzar, picture of Satan, Babylon, picture of the kingdom of Satan, consisting all the nations. And the way this worked, 23 years, May 21, 1988 through May 21, 2011, 23 exact years. And then the judgment on the church completed. Great tribulation finished. And then we read Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So the tribulation completed, and then Mark 13 tells us of another tribulation. Although we're not told the duration here, it says in Mark 13, verse 24, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars of heaven shall fall. So there's an earlier tribulation that was called those days, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Then there's a second tribulation in those days after that tribulation. Second period of time, also called those days, two tribulations at the end of the world, two judgments. We've known that for a long time. We've known it for a long time. Judgment begins at the house of God and then transitions to the world. Two targets, two objects of wrath. And only we didn't call them both tribulation. We called one great tribulation, we called the other judgment day. And yet we've learned judgment day is not a single day. It's a longer period of time. And over the course of this period since May 21, 2011, this prolonged judgment, this tribulation period, we know God is recompensing, repaying Satan and his forces, who are the unsaved of the world, for daring to stretch forth their hand against God's anointed. For an example of that, just a small example of that. The churches were given up by God, and so they engaged in much apostasy and terrible wickedness in the churches. And the news media loved to report it and magnified it whenever it happened concerning a pastor, concerning insane doctrine in a church or anything they could find. And that was according to the will of God or God's permissive will, in the sense that the object of his wrath is typically publicly humiliated and ridiculed and mocked. And so the world was publicly carrying that out, and God permitted it. And that's all part of the kingdom of Babylon. You know, the news media was the mouthpiece of the world, or the mouthpiece of that kingdom. And God used it to judge the church. Well, now, here we are. The only thing that's changed is time and movement from the focus being exclusively on the church to now on the whole world. Now, how is the news media viewed by the world increasingly? Well, the news media itself is publicly humiliated, ridiculed, and mocked. You see that? Why? I've mentioned this before. Growing up, anyone who has any age to them remembers the news media was highly respected, and you just thought they always spoke the truth, and you might have had a preference, this channel to that channel, but they were highly regarded, and nobody was calling them fake news or thought they were biased. And now, what has changed? Well, what's changed is the news media and the whole world and all the world institutions are the target. They are the object of the wrath of God. And so they are experiencing the spiritual judgment just as the church before them. It's recompense. They're being repaid. They should not have stretched forth their hand against God's anointed, no matter if God gave up his anointed. That's God's business. No man, Satan or men should not have mocked and humiliated. It's akin to the idea of Saul, the king of Israel, an apostate king seeking to kill David, yet David would not dare to stretch forth his hand against him. And Saul really represents the apostate corporate church. And it just shows the respect, the dignity that one should have who is in the role of a king. And we have to remember all God's saints were spiritual kings. And so all in the churches who have the name of Christ are saying they are as a king. And they're more, of course, in the line of Saul than David. But nonetheless, there should have been respect shown that was not shown, and God took note. God took note. And so now we see the daily public absolute humiliation of news media in much of the world.
Thanks for watching, and be on the lookout for more new open forum excerpts that will be added periodically.